I'm Hannah, and today I'm going to be talking about Susan Stryker's works, Dungeon Intimacies, and My Words to Victor Frankenstein Above the Village of Chamonix, performing transgender rage. A quick disclaimer, while I live with one foot in the genderqueer community, I am not a transgender woman, nor do I have firsthand experiences with transphobia or any other experiences as living not as my assigned gender is birth. I get read as woman, and that is fine with me right now. I don't really mean to speak over or speak out of turn, and I welcome all feedback and criticism. So now that that's out of the way, I really enjoyed the readings for this week, and I was overwhelmed by the tenderness of both of these essays. Stryker's theories of resistance and transgresses are made really personal and touching by her use of personal narrative and poetry and musings throughout. I really appreciated that both of her essays kind of bled out of theory into the real world or into the literary world. The best example being the shocking, yet intimate, as she describes it, setting of the dungeon. Another example of this bleeding over into the real world is the stage directions in performing transgender rage, which describe her outfit and show rather than preach the resistance that she is embodying in her work. The stories of her personal life, which show the pains of navigating the birth of her partner's child, and the poetry included in transgender resistance, add emphasis for me to the importance and multifacetedness and broad applicability to queer theory of her work. There's many nodes of theory expression and many locations of personal and collective resistance, which are clear in these writings. So today I am going to be connecting this to a book that I read last year by Eric Plemons, I'm not sure, The Look of a Woman, which was an anthropological and ethnographic study of facial feminization surgery in the United States. In this book, he talks of the many nodes of queer theory which interact in this and intersect in the location of this surgery, which, like SRS, which is sex reassignment surgery, it is a trans therapeutic that has the main goal of feminizing a male face through the removal or reduction of bone and soft tissue. Now, the reason that I wanted to talk about this surgery is because of the discourse around it, and it stands in sharp contrast to the exact type of physical, visceral abjection that surrounds the performance of this surgery. And I'll read a section later describing one of these procedures so that you can see what I mean. Now, in both Transgender Rage and Dungeon Intimacies, Stryker is very interested in the sites of the BDSM dungeon and the trans body as a kind of paradoxical, resistant, and generative space. In Dungeon Intimacies, she has a great quote where she says, "The dungeon is indeed such a productive and transformative space as a laboratory. A space not merely for the discovery of an existing objective world, but a playground, workshop, or place of study that is in fact a generative space, one facilitative of the materialization of creatively grasped virtualities. It is place as process, or, in geographer Doreen Massey's words, a place as a distinctive mixture, a gathering and manifestation of local and global, social, economic, and communications relationships that knot themselves up together for a length of time, and which become concretized in the objects that collectively constitute their place by assembling there." So my argument is that FFS is a similar generative space for both the idea of femininity, big scare quotes there, and transness, and the conditions, for example, transmedicalization, that surround it complicate it as a boundless generative space. But I think it's more complicated than simply a space of erasure or invisibility of queerness, as someone like Stryker might argue. I think that the gory and visceral procedure by which someone's face gets surgically rearranged in order to make it more feminine has generative properties and can exist as another example of defying nature that Stryker mentions in Transgender Rage. If this is the case, my conclusion is that debates around like the progressiveness or validity of FFS are less fruitful than examining the barriers to its access and navigating the external social circumstances which cause FFS to be so vital and life-changing as an operation. And by this I mean making society safer for trans people who might not want to have to get FFS to escape violence and harassment. So, Susan Stryker's 1994 essay, My Words to Victor Frankenstein, above the village of Chamonix, performing transgender rage, lays out a theory of resistance that's both radical and tender, transformative and personal. Stryker is responding to transphobic writers such as Janice Raymond and Mary Daly, who argue that transsexual bodies are monstrous, a necrophiliac invasion of female space that must be morally mandated out of existence. Their words, not mine. Now, this essentialist view that there is a steady female essence that eludes MTF transgender people, it's still being hashed out today in the crevices and often not so dark corners of Twitter and of YouTube. Transgender exclusionary radical feminists deny transsexual bodies their agencies and identity by positing them as other monstrously so. Stryker refutes this argument by using the story of Frankenstein's monster to highlight the destabilizing and generative power of the monster. Monstrum, from the Latin divine portent, Stryker says, symbolizes a warning, heralds an extraordinary transformation of matter and being, a queer relationship to nature. In other words, transgender bodies defy the immortality and perfection of the pursuits of modern science, which, according to Stryker, is inseparable from the pursuit of immortality through the perfection of the body, the fantasy of total mastery through transcendence of an absolute limit, and the hubristic desire to create life itself. Instead, transgender bodies rise up from the operating tables of our rebirth, something more and something other than the creatures that our makers intended us to be. This transgression of nature gives the monstrosity that Stryker experiences as a transgender woman a different location. In the disidentification with compulsorily assigned subject positions and the establishment of subjects in new modes regulated by intelligibility. In other words, this monstrosity reveals the constructedness of the natural order and has the effect of suggesting that this constructedness is widespread and might be more easily accessible than you would think. Stryker's transgender rage, as follows, is a result of this unintelligibility of this new constructed materiality versus the constraints and tensions which hold her down and oppress her. It's a queer fury and emotional response to the conditions in which it becomes imperative to take up, for the sake of one's own continued survival as a subject, a set of practices that precipitates one's exclusion from a naturalized order of existence that seeks to maintain itself as the only possible basis for being a subject. The medicalization, for example, the denotation as deviant or something sexually wrong with the person, has been a site of this monstrosity and an example of one of the constraints that has been put on this subjecthood. But for Stryker, rage, fury, and reclamation are productive and generative forces. Dungeon Intimacies also deals with the subject of convergent spaces. Stryker uses the example of a BDSM dungeon to highlight how the choreograph of sadomasochism, played out between two or more people, involves both intimacy and extreme pain or degradation or things like that, all of which are located in the body in the dungeon. She uses this as kind of like an example of one of these generative space. The dungeon involves reconceptualism and rematerialization, which in turn allow for generative rupture in the spaces rendered by these breaking down of barriers. Stryker cites the dungeon as a place where the perceived patterns of identification, affect, sensation, etc. all break down. She uses the example of an erotic flogging where the subject is transformed from a woman named Ian in a PhD program to a subject of intense sadomasochism, freed by fantasy and desire and reaffirmed in the choreograph of the flogging that Stryker is participating in. For example, Stryker writes about the types of generative poesis or creation that happens. She writes, I could hear people use names and pronouns in reference to me that I could agree to answer to. I could feel the touch upon my body of clothes that encouraged certain modes of comportment or stylized manners of moving, clothing that gendered me in the act of wearing them. In dungeon space, I could see a woman in the mirror and step into the place of woman in the structure of another's desire, to witness those bodily signs, the heaves and shudders and seeping fluids, that attested to my viable occupation of that fantasized place for them. Plemons traces the origin and discourse surrounding FFS in The Look of a Woman. FFS began as a viable trans therapeutic in San Francisco in the 1980s, largely as a result of the Stanford maxillocranial surgeon Douglas Osterhout. Osterhout turned to physical anthropology, categorization based on sex differences, and pioneered a surgical way to reproduce these differences on the skull in order to create a feasible surgical plan. He focused on the normal or average female face for devising these standards, which, as you can imagine, was a loaded and controversial idea. Other surgeons, for example, would go on to associate femininity with aesthetics or sex appeal instead of like a normal median what a female face should look like. Osterhout's early patients were white and wealthy, and his surgery did not deviate from the type of feminine norm that he had championed with his surgical research. Osterhout was guided by the wrong body model, which was a way of understanding transition from a medical point of view. Its principles were of two distinct sexes, male and female, and believed that sex difference was mostly based on genitals. Thus, Osterhout saw FFS as a supplement for genital surgery, one that was more visible and cogent in everyday situations. He often told stories of improved lives that his patients had. For example, one who received FFS at his clinic who called him back to tell him that she was no longer harassed out and about in her neighborhood. However, the shift in trans activism, of which Susan Stryker was a part, eventually made its way into trans medicine, though not entirely, and certainly not in New Brunswick out here, where it is we're still having a problem accessing care. But anyways, I will keep the politics to the side. Instead of a pathology of individuals, this activism shifted towards a focus on social pathology. The idea that the will to pathologize and medicalize gendered being was a sign of a society that was sick instead of the individuals being the ones that needed to change. Susan Stryker is one of those queer theorists writing in this era, and I hope you were able to see how poetics, narration, and identity in her essay contribute to the self-determination and liberation that are at the heart of her themes. And as you can guess, in light of these politics, FFS became less of a supplementary surgery to the more important sex reassignment surgery. And more, its own merits were considered on their own within a model of recognition. The model of recognition theory gauged the efficacy of the surgery not only in the successful matching of a patient's face with a female norm, but also in the everyday scenes and interactions wherein the patient would be interacting with the social norm. The importance of the face as being seen and being engaged with as a woman in this model can't be understated. Kind of reminds me of my previous presentation where I talked about the self as it's recognized. Plemons seems to agree with this self needing to be reflected back in the world. He says, faces are assessed in the consultation room and are reconstructed in the operating room, but the question of whether FFS produced its desired effect is answered everywhere else. From this point of view, FFS is a generative and dynamic and productive trans therapeutic because it allows this type of recognition as woman instead of man. And since this recognition has very great political and social stake, for example, relieving dysphoria, being able to pass, it's a site of creation of a new identity, of a new type of gendered being, albeit being still a medical one. As the flesh literally gets rearranged, a new and hopefully affirming being will emerge on this site of social recognition and exchange. Nature gets molded and transformed, and the materiality of gender, by this I mean the flesh, the bodies, and what they signify, they become a site of positive instability and resignification, much like the dungeon and dungeon intimacies. However, a complete affirmation of the wonders of FFS would be missing out on some of the theory and discourse around it. Trans opponents of FFS challenge the political implications of effacing gender difference. To some, while FFS might enable in-person attributions of unmarked femaleness, this invisibility that FFS aims for works against a project of trans liberation, which is premised on the visible presence of trans people, not as normative men and women, but as distinctly trans. Some trans activists refuse to be defined by the reductive and overdetermined ontologies that medical discourse tries to produce around them. For example, Plemons talks about Sandy Stone's foundational essay, The Empire Strikes Back, a post-transsexual manifesto, which articulates this resistance and calls for a new transsexual politics organized by a will to remain visible as trans. For Stone, passing and disappearing were not measures of trans success. They helped reproduce the very conditions of vulnerable invisibility that had alienated trans people so much. Stone argued instead that the radical act of living visibly and legibly as a trans person had the potential to undermine and pull apart the pathological narratives of trans existence and destabilize the very structures of genders on which they lay. Another caveat or thing to think about is the way in which FFS was framed by the surgeons providing the care. As American medicine has largely historically been very neglectful of trans people, again, we see that here even today, the process of FFS has been shaped by what Plemons talks about as a geography of care. This is a concept brought up by Milligan and Power in their 2010 analysis. A geography of care is a space where surgeons and patients make sense of their relationship to each other and the way that they think of themselves as patients and of surgeons. Dangerous backroom care was all over the place in America before the standardization and progress in trans therapeutics. For example, these would range from doctors who would do dangerous under-the-table silicone implants to a bizarre murder case. In this one, the doctor, John Brown, defended his murder charge after a leg amputation went very wrong by claiming that actually he was a good person because he had done many SRS, sex reassignment surgeries, as many as 600 on transgender people. Not because of the money that he charged, But because he was a brave and caring person who was willing to treat these transsexuals when no one else would, he used this as part of his defense. Thus, Plemons coins the term restitutive intimacy to frame the relationship between doctor and FFS patient, wherein there's a historical imbalance caused by trauma and a lack of care and surgery. It manifests in this geography of care as a surgeon's insistence on his own reputation and benevolence in care of patients. And in an economy where FFS costs in the tens of thousands, the willingness to treat trans patients and the goodness of their heart is overshadowed or challenged or kind of doesn't really make sense, or at least you'd hope very much so, considering that the immense barriers to care are huge, tens of thousands of dollars. And this systemic injustice against trans people, this lack of safe and accessible care, provides a very strong marketing point to surgeons who conflate their care for their patients with the business that they bring. Gratitude and appreciation dominate the geography of care of trans women who receive FFS. And this can obscure or easily allow others to glance over the huge cost of the surgery. However, some good news is that landscape is starting to show some signs of change. My roommate's wife received FFS from the student of Douglas Osterhout, the OG. His student is based in San Francisco, and follows many of the same principles as his teacher. And her 2017 FFS was the first to be covered by health insurance at Starbucks in the United States. And as a result, she did a bunch of interviews and was kind of an emblem of, okay, this might be more accessible to people, which I think is pretty cool. However, I still think that FFS is a process of bodily generative poiesis. I don't think you can get rid of the objection entirely, and here's why I think this. Plemons says that there is a constant tension between the theoretical tools that I had for thinking about sex, gender, and bodies, and the irreducibly material and visceral facts of the radical facial surgery that was being used to shape these theories. He then goes on to describe his first-hand experiences shadowing a surgery with Osterhout. His prose shows the contrast between the visceralness and the intimacy contained in that surgery. I have an excerpt below, but I will include a link to the full PDF in the description so you'll know where not to find it. For legal purposes, where not to find it. And I really think that this chapter 5, is absolutely life-changing and very encapsulative of the tensions that are in this surgery. So, if you don't mind me reading, I'll do that now. Osterhout draped sterile blue towels over Rosalind, the patient's, hair, and secured them in place with skin staples. Fully draped from head to toe, only Rosalind's face was showing. He placed a stitch in each of her eyelids to keep her eyes closed and thus moist while her face was tugged and moved throughout the operation. All was ready to proceed. Osterhout announced the time of the first incision. The CN recorded it on the whiteboard on the wall, and the operation began. Incision started above each ear and met at the center of Rosalind's head just behind her hairline. Her forehead skin, from hairline to orbits, was folded down over her eyes like a blindfold. The raw underside of her downturned skin was spotted with blooming red of severed blood vessels. What she had called her Neanderthal brow pre-surgery was revealed now, not as an effect of bone, but bone itself. So much smooth white bone. Osterhout dipped the wooden handle of a cotton swab in methylene blue dye to mark the membrane that lines the outer surface of the bones. He cut at these lines and scraped it forward into Rosalind's eye sockets. The bone surface was thus prepared. Glancing at the diagrams illuminated on the wall-mounted lightboard, He used a yellow wooden pencil to mark the places where he would begin to burr and saw her forehead bone. The burr tool whirred like a dental drill as it ground down the undesirably bony prominences above her eyes. Bone particles flew off the burr and caught in the folds of my scrubs as I leaned in. By the end of the procedure, they would become dry, chalky dust. Ousterhout replaced the burr attachment with an oscillating saw blade and began to cut along the pencil-drawn lines. He wedged the blunt end of the forceps into the cut and pried the bone up out of its face. There was a dull cracking sound when the frontal bone was dislodged from the skull. The surgical nurse collected the irregular oblong piece of bone, about 2 inches across, and set it in the white plastic lid of a sample cup for safekeeping. The frontal sinus was revealed. Frontal sinuses, about 95% of us have them, are all structured differently. Rosalind's was internally asymmetrical, divided by thin walls of bone into 3 distinct cavities. These sinuses are usually empty, but sometimes brain matter can protrude into them. Rosalind's had filled with blood, making it hard to see what was inside. "Is that brain or sinus?" he asked, to no one in particular. "Not sure. Let's go slow." So, historical and ethical dynamics, the clinical space of transmedicine. They shape the surgeon's experiences and understandings, and I don't think they can be entirely separated from the surgery. However, I think the question comes down to whether the impetus or the effect of the surgery is placed within the generative process of what comes after the surgery, and whether that type of visibility is more important than being read as queer or trans. And again, these are my 2 questions to think about before class. And finally, you should absolutely go ahead and read Chapter 5, The Operating Room. It may not be Chapter 5, but I'm pretty sure it is. To finish reading on your own time about the surgery, if you are interested. Honestly, that whole PDF is incredible. But yeah, my questions are, do you think that the oppressive norms and structures of heteronormativity and class and cost and things like that override the space of generative poiesis, or do you think that the transformative power of FFS overrides that? And also, too, I know that I am coming at this as a pretty mostly cis person, and that I have never considered FFS for myself, so I am not sure if that type of question is even, a good one to be thinking about. But these are my thoughts. Thank you so much for listening. I'm so sorry this went on for so long.